You're listening to Criticaleye's Inspiring Leaders podcast. Criticaleye is a global membership community with over 2 decades of experience supporting senior executives in their roles. We work with board-level executives, giving them opportunities to build their knowledge, skills, and access independent reference points outside of their immediate networks. Whether you're stepping up into a more senior role or aspiring to do so, looking to hone high-level stakeholder relationships, drive operational performance, build your own personal resilience as a leader, or have longer-term career goals such as moving into a plural career, Criticaleye's approach supports a range of leadership challenges and ambitions.
Well, welcome to this latest episode of Criticaleye's Inspiring Leaders podcast, recorded here at our Chief People Officer retreat. And so what we'll be looking at is how to make that transition from a divisional or regional Chief People Officer role to a Group CPO role, which is something that we support a lot of our members at Criticaleye with in that career transition, and we get asked about a lot. So delighted to be joined by two speakers to talk through their own experiences in this regard. So Jane Pateman, previously a Group HR Director at Biffa, and now Non-Executive Director and RemCo Chair at Knights PLC, and Vicky Wallis, Chief People Officer at Direct Line Group. For an introduction context setting, perhaps, Jane, if I start with you, in your view, what does it take to successfully transition into the Group CPO role? What are the main challenges and opportunities as you see it?
Well, I think it's probably different if you're transitioning within an organisation than it is transitioning into the role if you're coming out of another organisation. So for me, I did sort of divisional HRD roles within Centrica, and then I moved out of Centrica to take my group HRD role. So I think that gives you an opportunity actually to kind of refresh your style and try some kind of new things. I think the difference is, you are accountable, aren't you? You are the person that's making the decisions and driving things forward and leading the team. So it's your strategy. So that's the difference. I think you're a participant. If you're in a divisional HR role, you might be slightly siloed because you're just thinking about what the priorities are for that division. Whereas when you're in a group role, you've got to think of the whole bigger picture. So yeah, for me, that would be the sort of biggest thing to think about when you transition.
Thanks, Jane. Vicky?
Hi, yes, Vicky Wallis here. So for me, I think probably my transition was similar to yours, Jane, in terms of it being I moved from RBS to Santander, and that's when I took on my first sort of Chief People Officer role there. And I think the biggest transition for me in terms of that move was actually the interaction with the board. And not having had that interaction in the same way before. You might go as a divisional director to certain meetings, but suddenly to have that relationship and the accountability for that relationship from a people perspective was a big move for me. I think also the second area is that really came home to me at that point was actually it's not just about you being an HR specialist anymore. You're bigger than that, and you've almost got to find yourself, what's your seat round this ExCo table, which isn't just about being the people person. You sort of got to elevate yourself to being more of a commercial leader as well. And so I always define it as you just end up with multiple plates to spin, with, the function to run, the ExCo to be part of, the stakeholders to manage, which includes the board and external stakeholders as well. And so it's quite complex.
Yeah, great.
And it will require a mindset shift,
yes,
as well in that. When moving from divisional or regional, what do you think some of those key competencies, leadership skills required are? If I can come back to you again, Vicky, on that.
I think in making that shift, you've got to adjust to what your role therefore is. I.e., you can't be in the minutiae of everything anymore. So you've got to elevate yourself and be comfortable that you actually have the right capability around you and your team. to actually allow you the mindset shift to be a leader of the whole group, taking the end-to-end accountability for the HR angle, but also the role at ExCo. So the shift is actually starting to let go of some things and making room for actually filling it with other activities that become more critical in that role.
I think you have to become more of a business person as well. So you've got to understand the financials as well. You've got to understand the whole business strategy. Whereas I think in a divisional role, that's less so. You're playing a part, but you're not leading. So although you are the HR expert, you're much broader than that, I think. And as you said, Vicky, not into the weeds of things. You've really got to lift yourself out. That is quite a step up, actually, because, you've often got to where you've got to because you're really good at getting things done, really good at rolling your sleeves up. So actually to kind of lift yourself up to that level and think, I need people to do these things for me is quite different, particularly when you can do them yourself, and that might be your natural sort of inclination.
How do you think people can help prepare or position themselves for that group role if you're currently divisional, looking to make that step up? What can you do?
I think when I was at Centrica, it was a very big business and lots of opportunity to do different things. So I was always the person that was sort of had my hand up to do the next project, and so then you get more exposure. So I did a couple of projects in Centrica where I did get exposure to the board and the exec team and had to present quite regularly to them. So I think that really helps sort of get to understand how things work. I think also sort of understanding all the elements of HR, so particularly remuneration, I think, is a fairly critical one when you're in a group HRD role, and that becomes much more of a responsibility than it did at a divisional HRD level, where you are probably just implementing the group policy. So group policy level, thinking about the different businesses that you're representing and how you do that is also critical.
I totally agree with that. I think putting your hand up for opportunities that might give you to exposure to some of the things that you might experience more at a group level, and that may be a bit of a stretch because it's on top of your day job, but actually I think that's invaluable. A particular individual that I'm thinking of, who I've been sort of working through, sort of coaching through, put herself into a sort of culture role within the function to allow herself the opportunity to then go to the board and present on culture. And I think if you work with the board chairs, you can actually find some of them who are supportive of allowing divisional HRDs to come and observe, which is invaluable because you don't get the chance to actually experience the meeting until you're often sitting in these seats, and by that point, you're in the hot seat and you're accountable. So if you can come and observe, and the board are up for that, and I think a lot of chairs are now up for that opportunity, particularly the RemCo chairs. I think that's invaluable for somebody because they can listen and observe it without having to be the one that's accountable for the conversation. I think that's quite a helpful preparation as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, as a group HRD, latterly I did even more than of that because I really wanted my team to be able to present to the board and feel comfortable because, depending on my successor, they've got to be confident about presenting themselves. So I definitely did that with my reward director, my talent director, and sort of got them more comfortable within the board. So I'd be there, but I'd sort of almost facilitate it and let them do all the work. But it worked quite well for them to get that exposure.
I think it's really good, and I think actually the opportunity to write the paper. Paper writing is an underestimated part of the relationship, and I think one of the questions we're going to come on to is about trust, is about the ability to write confidently but succinctly about what your agenda items are, and actually giving somebody the opportunity to write those. It can be really hard to write a good paper, but there is an art to it, and I think giving people the opportunity ahead to do that, I think, is really helpful as well. And then they go and present it. They're really owning the whole thing.
You've both alluded to some of those key stakeholders, so perhaps we just expand that a little bit. I'll come back to you, Jane. Who who would be some of those key stakeholders in your mind that you need to make sure that you're influencing to start with, and then your advice to someone in order to build those strong relationships?
Yeah, I mean, I stepped out of Centrica to go into my first Group HRD role, but I had a very strong relationship with my Group HRD at Centrica, and so I had a lot of exposure to the board anyway, so I sort of benefited from that. As I stepped then into the new Group HRD role, your relationship with the CEO becomes the absolute focus, and the CFO as well. So your focus is different. You've got your team to manage, but actually your relationships aren't so much with your peers. They're your peers on the exec team and in the board as well. So you've got to focus on those relationships. And I think you have to establish yourself pretty quickly. So, if you go in as a Group HRD, you're going to be expected to present your strategy after probably 90 days.
Yep.
I think is the kind of thing. So you've got to say what it is that you think that we should be doing, what's missing, what's great, what isn't so great. It's a different focus. Whereas as a divisional HRD, you'd be part of a team, an HRLT probably, and you've got your colleagues that are specialists in certain areas as well as other divisional HRDs, but they're not the group of people that you're going to be spending most of your time with as you move into that Group HRD role.
Totally agree. And investing the time in that, I think, is invaluable, because you build the trust and the understanding of. Because, again, for me, coming back to the board and my first experience of a board, their agenda is quite different to the executive, and you need to therefore understand what's going to be on their minds, what they're concerned about, which isn't what perhaps you're used to people being concerned about. So spending time and actually engaging in a conversation about what's important to you from the role I'm doing, what can help you do your job as RemCo Chair or Board Risk Chair or whatever it might be that I can be supporting with, I think it's a real investment of time, but it's hugely valuable.
Yeah.
And seeking feedback actually on how you're landing.
Yeah.
Am I bringing the right things? Are you feeling confident that we're covering what we need to cover? I think although it's nerve-wracking asking the question when you're new, it is quite helpful to get that feedback.
Yeah, great.
And for both of you coming into an organisation from another organisation and becoming the Chief People Officer there, looking at your own personal journey, how did you know or think about what your leadership style needed to change and evolve into being, and how did you evolve as a leader through that step up, looking back?
Looking back, I don't know that I'd thought about it as much as I probably should have done. It sort of happened on the fly as you're experiencing it. You learn through probably some of the harder experiences about how you're going to have to modify this balance of all the different activities you're going to do, the different stakeholders, and actually knowing when you need to seek help and mentoring or guidance so that you're not to feel afraid. And I think I actually leaned towards that towards the end of my first year, my first CPO role, and got some mentoring help, which was invaluable in terms of bouncing ideas. Because to your point, it is, you are the isolated voice around that table now. You're not in a team anymore in that way. And actually, if you want to bounce ideas or suggestions on your approach, then it's finding the right people to talk to give you that support, and then just build your confidence, I think. That was definitely a learning for me.
My first Group HRD role was a baptism of fire. So when you talk about crisis management, that's where I really honed my skills. So I joined a business called Connaught that went into administration 15 months after I joined. So the first profit warning was 12 months after I joined, and then 3 months later it was in administration. By which time I was the longest serving member of the exec team. The CEO had gone, the CFO had gone. I was working really closely with the chairman, actually, because there was nobody else that kind of left, and we had to bring in some interim managers to try and manage the whole situation. So I did learn on the fly, but I think I learned a lot about myself. I mean, it was an absolutely dreadful time, And when I was in it, it was awful. But actually, when I look back, I think I learned so much from that. I learned about, trying to do the right thing, even in difficult circumstances, holding on to, what you really believed in. My own resilience, actually, and tenacity to kind of get stuff done in a really, really difficult situation. So, yeah, probably quite different than other people's first HRD role, but it didn't put me off. And I went on to be Group HRD. Straight away, actually, I had no gap at Biffa. Actually, that business was in a difficult place at the time, so this is where I kind of realised that I was quite good at sorting problems out, and I probably didn't really know that I was as good at that until that sort of happened, and it was private equity owned at the time, and quite difficult because there's this constant demand for data. But kind of what I learned there was stick to what you want to do, stick to your agenda, do what's right for the business, develop your strategy, and carry on sort of regardless, and kind of that's what I did.
Baptism of fire is how we've heard it described before. What are some of the common pitfalls that you think those aspiring can fall into?
Well, I think to keep doing the detail. So you've probably got to where you got to because you're good at the detail and you're good at delivering those things. So I think it's a slightly different skill set. So yes, it's useful. So, I can be well into the detail. And I've done lots of jobs in HR, so I've probably got quite a lot of experience, and it's very easy for me to say, well, I've done that before, but you've got to develop your team to do that. So it is different because you're not doing it all yourself, and you've got to encourage others to do it. So I think the pitfall is you'll just get into the weeds and then you're not thinking about the bigger picture, whereas you need to be going out into the business, spending time with the business leaders, really understand them so that you build credibility as a business leader rather than just as somebody that knows about HR practice.
I totally agree, and I think that to the point that you make there is actually you are going to lean on your team more and delegate more to them. Actually, what you do need to make sure is that you really have got the right quality people in those key roles, particularly the REM role, for in terms of the link to the board specifically, and not, it sounds a bit brutal, but not sitting on poor performance, because actually it then will drag you back in and stops you doing the role that you really should be doing for the organisation. So I think that can be a pitfall as well.
And then finally, before we wrap up our conversation today, how do you see the role changing in the future, Vicky, if I come back to you on that? And what advice would you give to one aspiring to that role in 2025?
Yeah, I mean, the role is expanding all over the place at the moment, actually. I mean, you've got some organisations creating it into more of a coup role, where it takes much more accountability for a wider brief, which maybe include property. It may be including, then also there's the element of sustainability and the ESG agenda coming into the HR space, transformation as well, often sitting in the HR space, not just from a people perspective. So I think, there's a world of opportunity actually, from a developmental perspective, rather than it being the purest role that it has been perhaps sort of 10 years ago, but we've seen it evolve. I think the pandemic probably evolved it in one way, and then it's continued since then. So my advice to somebody would be, again, back to the point we've been making, seek out as many opportunities as you can to diversify your experience before you get to the point of thinking you're ready, whether that be going into a commercial role, which I think is hugely valuable. I never did that, and I often think it would have been a great thing to have had that opportunity, or expand into sustainability, or expand into property, whatever it might be, because it will all be valuable in terms of feeding your capability to step into these larger roles.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think increasingly you need skills in change management, and businesses are understanding the big changes that they're going through is about the people and the culture as well as the technology, and the way technology is developing now so quickly. I think those change management skills are really important. But I think the world has changed. People, the HR Group HR director, the CPO might have been focused on things like attrition, data D&I, and all of those things. And I'm not saying they're not focused on those now, but there is a whole other agenda, sustainability being up there, and shareholder interest in ESG. My first 5 years as a group HRD, I didn't speak to shareholders unless I went to a shareholder event or the AGM. But increasingly my last few years, they wanted to talk to me. They wanted to talk to me about diversity and other things that we were doing, well-being, pay and conditions, trade union relationships, all of those things. So shareholders are interested in that, which means boards are interested in that. And so the exposure to the board just got greater and greater. Some of that might have been because, you get to know them and they get to know you. But actually, I think it's just the agenda for boards has changed. And so it's a fantastic time for a CPO to kind of really get that experience. So, yeah, my advice would be, put your hand up, volunteer for stuff. Write the board papers. That's a really, really good point. Actually, the board presentations, try and get some exposure at the board. Talk to your group HRD, make sure they're really aware of what your ambition is to support that development.
Well, Jane, Vicky, thank you very much for the conversation. I enjoyed it, and very good of you for sharing your experience there. That concludes this episode of the Inspiring Leaders podcast. For those listening, please do check out our other podcasts and work at Criticaleye with Chief People Officers. We're all at the CPO retreat today, so look forward to catching up with you both a bit more later on. Thank you and have a good day.